All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm getting used to the fact that I can't see you, but you can see me. Um, we're really happy to have you all here today for taking the lead. There'll be a webinar about how advocates can shape news coverage of the criminal legal system. I know that folks might be coming to this with different levels of experience with working with journalists, and I hope that this webinar has a little something for everyone. Um, so without further ado, I think let's get started. Um, oh, and of course here we are. So I'll start with some quick logistics. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Wanda. I'm the communications strategist at the Prison Policy Initiative. I handle our relationships with the media, and I am our spokesperson to the press as well. So I do a lot of interviews. And I've been here for about 8 years. Hannah, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hey, everyone. Super excited to be here as a longtime fangirl of Prison Policy Initiative and everything they do. I work at a small journalism support organization called the Center for Just Journalism. We work with newsrooms and individual journalists who are covering public safety, whether that's specific beat reporting about, prisons and the carceral apparatus, or healthcare and the environment, and sort of broadening the ways that we think about what safety looks like. And before that, I worked a bit more in the advocacy world, doing comms at the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I'm based in Atlanta.
Great. So we are going to go for about an hour or an hour and a half, somewhere in that range. This is being recorded. If you have to jump off, do not fear. It will be posted online later. It's going to be posted on the Prison Policy Initiative's website as part of our advocacy toolkit, which also has a number of other resources for advocates. Highly recommend checking it out. Um, if you have questions as we go along, I encourage you to drop them in the Q&A box. We are going to handle questions at the end during about 15 minutes of scheduled Q&A. If we see things that feel really appropriate to address in the moment, we will also maybe do that. Um, so with table setting out of the way, let's get situated. What are we doing here? Um, the media does not usually represent incarcerated people or people under supervision or their families or their advocates. And journalists don't usually come to their beats with well-rounded perspectives on incarceration uh, and criminalization. That puts advocates at a disadvantage when it comes to changing policies or to prevent the backsliding into tough on crime politics that we are currently seeing um, in state and local governments, to say nothing of the federal government. So we're here not just because the media can be a powerful tool in getting attention on important issues. We're also here because, unfortunately, criminal legal system agencies are very proactive in their own relationships with the media. And that influences coverage of how the system works, coverage of crime and community safety, and coverage of conditions behind bars. Uh, I'm going to quickly go through a few examples of that, of the criminal legal system's media outreach and action. First, as some of you know, the Illinois Department of Corrections recently announced that it would replace physical mail in prisons with digitized copies. They said that this was an emergency response, but really they've been laying the groundwork for this for over a year. This includes setting the tone in the media. And you can see here several stories that create a narrative about drug exposures being driven by the mail, sending corrections officers to the hospital. This is all very intentionally cultivated press coverage. Um, Here is another policy related example. This year, conservative lawmakers in California launched a campaign to disqualify people convicted of first-degree murder or a number of sex offenses from the elderly parole program. As we know, disqualifying people with these more serious convictions is enough to decimate elder parole. But that's not how a lot of news stories framed it. The chief sponsor of the bill clearly talked to a lot of journalists and framed this change as quote unquote closing a loophole in the elder parole program that had allowed people convicted of these offenses to qualify for parole consideration. And media outlets took that framing and they ran with it. They didn't even ask this legislator to explain what the quote unquote loophole was that they were closing. They just used this framing, and that was a framing that made this appear like a very common sense piece of legislation and not something that was going to really destroy or hurt the elder parole program. I'll turn it over to Hannah now to talk about some other ways that the system creates coverage.
Thanks, Wanda. Yeah, we're starting with kind of the bleak stuff up front, but I promise that there's going to be, and now what do we do about this afterwards? I want to talk just super briefly about the ways in which the media can kind of create either out of really disparate incidents or sometimes just out of nowhere these moral panics and crime waves, basically. I know everyone on this call knows this pattern, but I think it's especially loud in the criminal legal space. There are so many examples of media-driven panics that end up with these, far more harsh punitive policies. But I want to talk about the recent retail theft panic moment. The first thing that I ask journalists when I see these stories start piling up is this very simple, like, are we seeing a crime wave or are we seeing a coverage wave? So with retail theft, basically what happened is the label organized retail theft got slapped onto a lot of different things. A few of these sensational like smash and grab videos ran everywhere. This is a screenshot from one of them. And then industry anecdotes and press releases took the place of actual data. The retail industry has a very strong PR apparatus, just like the criminal legal system. Shrink numbers, which also includes things like just errors or fraud, got piled into the shoplifting totals. So basically, you saw a number of sensational local cases get like stitched into this national surge. Then, again, this is a cycle we're all familiar with. Officials point to that coverage to launch these task forces and much tougher penalties. You can see one of the headlines here. And then the follow-up stories treat the announcements of these harsher penalties as proof that the crisis was a real thing. Of course, when you look at the numbers, it's not supported. There was not this clear spike. And it turned out that a lot of store closures who said that they had to close because of shoplifting, it was actually tracking with corporate strategy much more than any kind of actual crime on the ground. But that's the dynamic, right? A lot of coverage of this issue, very, very thin evidence or maybe none at all. And then this sort of feedback loop that just turns panic into policy. So I think a lot of the job of people on this call is to interrupt that loop early before it turns into this really harsh policy.
Right. So, as Hannah said, that's the bad news. The media is biased in favor of the system, and the system has a lot of resources at its disposal to keep it that way. Um, So we're here to talk about shifting the balance of news coverage away from the system, not just when it comes to specific policy campaigns, but also generally getting journalists to look differently at the system and to develop more of a perspective on criminalization. Um, so, to quickly preview what the next hour is going to consist of, we're going to go over First, some basic media 101, like who we're talking about when we talk about the media, and some of the jargon that you might have heard if you've talked to reporters before. We'll talk about some different objectives that you might have in developing relationships with reporters and what you can get out of these interactions. We're going to go over two ways of influencing news coverage. There's the informal way by building relationships, getting to know reporters. And then there's the formal way, which is pitching them. Um, and then lastly, we will go over what to do when a journalist asks to speak with someone who can lend a human face to the story, that often being someone who is directly impacted by the system, maybe still under state supervision, and how to keep these sources protected from risks. So let's get right to it. We'll start with a quick Media 101. So when we say the media, who are we really talking about? Um, Here you'll see the traditional answer, and it's still a big part of the answer. Daily, weekly newspapers, TV shows, public radio, talk radio, weeklies. Um, Even if you don't recognize all of these logos, there's probably some fonts or some logo styles here that look familiar. If you live in a mid-sized or large city, you probably have at least a weekly, if not a daily newspaper. If you turn on the radio, there's likely to be a public radio station, at least one talk radio station. Turn on the TV, you'll probably get an ABC affiliate, a Fox affiliate, PBS, maybe all three. So this is kind of the old guard of the media. But of course, the media is always changing. And there's a lot of other news outlets to keep in mind these days. First, I want to offer a quick disclaimer, which is that, as you all probably know, many people these days get their news from social media. That's not something that we're going to be talking about in this session. There is a great conversation to be had about how to, amplify the work that you all are doing on social. That's not today's conversation, but I will say that a lot of what social media consists of does still come from reported news. Um, and journalists themselves will use social media to report out their own stories. So building these kind of traditional relationships is still very much worth it. Um, and there's a bunch of other kind of news outlets that you might not always be thinking about, but that are emergent and important. There are several hundred nonprofit news outlets these days, many of which are affiliated with the organization's state's newsroom and state affairs. There is the local short form news corporation Axios, which has offices in a lot of major cities. There is the conservative state capitol reporting office, Center Square. Um, you've also got some very well-read blogs and newsletters, some of which are on Substack, many of which have their own websites. I've put a few kind of grab bag of examples in the bottom of the slide here. There are national uh, uh, online magazines like The Appeal, The Lever, Next City. There's publications that have a lens on race or LGBTQ issues, like Capital B. And then there's worker-run newsrooms, Hellgate in New York, Colorado Sun in Colorado. So there's a big landscape of media outlets to reach out to and to form relationships with. I'll hand it over to Hannah now to talk about some of the jargon that you might hear when you're talking to these folks.
Yes, we love jargon. Before I start broadly, as much as I would like there to be a consensus with everyone around what these terms mean, um, I have been doing this work long enough to know that there isn't. So I'm going to go through these, but remember that there isn't really one universal meaning for off the record or on background or not for attribution, whatever. Different reporters use them differently. I think sometimes there's generational differences. So I always treat these terms as negotiated, not assumed. So, before I start a call with a reporter, especially if it's someone that I don't have a relationship with, I'll say, Can we define the terms for this call? What does background mean to you? What can you use? How will you describe me? Etc. If we can't agree, which would be strange, but if for some reason we can't agree, then I will assume it's on the record and probably keep it kind of boring. So let's lay out quick shared language so that we're negotiating the same thing. So on the record, pretty straightforward. This means everything that we say in this conversation can be used and attributed to me by my name and probably my title, something that we've agreed on before. Again, that's the default unless we both agree otherwise before we speak. So I can't say something spicy and then downgrade and say, oh, actually, that's on background. If we want anything different, we agree to that first. Not for attribution and on background can get a little bit slippery. Not for attribution means you can quote the words that are said, but not my name. So we can agree upfront on some label, like an advocate familiar with the talks or whatever it is. And you can assume that it might be easy to guess from the quote and the way that you're described that it's still you. On background, again, I think this one can be a little slippery. Some reporters use it like not for attribution, and others mean no direct quotes, basically paraphrase only. But either way, you can use the information that I gave you, but you can't use my name. So again, want to make clear before you start the conversation, sort of which version you are using. And then, all right, off the record, not for publication. So it can be something that we talked about that you used to orient your reporting, or maybe something that you confirm with someone else, but you don't run it from me. That one is hopefully pretty straightforward. Also, just another reminder, like these aren't legal contracts. It's sort of an honor system that's built on trust. Obviously, most reporters don't want to burn a source, especially not one that they have a good relationship with, but obviously mistakes happen. I think again, if you're working with someone you don't know that well, or it's a particularly sensitive story, it never hurts to just reconfirm terms at the top of a call, maybe follow up with a quick email confirming we're on background. You can describe me as X and no direct quotes, something like that. All right, Wanda, you want to go to the next one? So just a little timing glossary here, going between on deadline versus I'm turning in this story or I'm filing it, whenever. When a reporter says they're on deadline, they have to publish or go to air if it's TV by a set time. It's often that day. But they usually have a little bit of wiggle room. If they say, I'm sending this to my editor at 4 Eastern, they're likely going to be able to do some small edits to the piece after it's with whoever is reviewing the draft. But after a deadline, then you're potentially getting into the realm of like asking for a correction or something after it's published, which is much harder to do. All right, next one. Okay, so embargoed just means I'm giving you this story early with the agreement that you're not going to publish it or post anything about it until the embargo lifts. So you would just make it explicit. This is under embargo until Tuesday, 9 a.m. Eastern. And that is not necessarily going to be just for one person. An exclusive means that you are offering this reporter like the first shot at the story before anyone else. So you're saying, if you take this, I'm not going to pitch to other outlets until your piece is up. And I will say exclusives are generally really worth it if you can make them happen. You usually get like better placement, a deeper story. The reporter has a bit more of an incentive to invest like real time in it. I think it improves accuracy because there's space for context and fact checking. It also sets the frame in a helpful way. Like other outlets will often follow the first story's angle and language. And if you like the reporter especially, it's a great opportunity to build a relationship with them.
Hey, Hannah, we have a question really quick from a
Oh,
viewer.
yes.
They want to know if you can give an example of when it might be helpful for an advocacy organization to talk on background versus when to speak off the record.
Great question. So I would say, let's say that someone calls you about a specific case. Let's say you're an attorney and you're like, I don't want to talk about this case at all. I can't talk about it. It's in litigation, but it pertains to this one issue that I think the reporter would, this story will be better if they understand this issue better. So in that instance, maybe you would say, this is completely off the record and it gives them a more in-depth understanding of the issue, but nothing that you say, even, whiffs of it are going to be in the story. I think if you're talking off the record, it's great if you're able to give another source who can then either give a background quote or a direct quote. So if you are an expert in this thing, which I know that we have experts in lots of cool things on this call, I would really encourage, yeah, off the record conversation, just help the reporter understand this. The system is clunky and confusing and opaque. And then point them in the direction of someone who can actually speak either on the record, which is probably what they want. Or if you want to do on background, if it's a little bit less sensitive, but you just don't want to be quoted directly, both of those I think tend to be like an opportunity to go even deeper into an issue with a reporter than giving an on the record quote because the conversation feels a little more stilted. It might be a bit shorter. So in general, I love talking on background. I think it often influences stories much more. I hope that answered the question.
Great. Well, moving on for now, and again, we can get back to some of these questions at the end. Um, let's talk a little bit about what you can get out of talking to reporters. Um, there's a lot of different ways that or reasons that you might want to build a relationship with reporters. At the top, I know I said, this is about tipping the balance of news coverage back towards advocacy and people living with the realities of criminalization. But in reality, there's several different objectives to keep in mind, and I've boiled it down to four buckets here: shaping news coverage, getting what we call clippings, using reporters to investigate the system, and using reporters to put pressure on the system. Um, Shaping news coverage, I'll start there. This means changing, influencing how reporters think and write about current events. Um, in this context, you can think about conversations with reporters kind of like interventions. Now, there are certain things that you can count on the media to cover. Contentious legislation and budget discussions, high-profile policy changes, big disasters, car crashes, and scandals. Now, if you can anticipate what kinds of topics these might be and proactively give reporters your view on them, you raise the chance that these topics get covered and that when they are covered, the reporter will build in your perspective, right? Um, as an example of this, as many of you know, the FCC announced in June that it was suspending its landmark prison telecom regulations from last year. We immediately pushed out a blog post talking about this and the impact that it was going to have on phone rates. Last week, I got a call from a reporter in Oklahoma who had received our blog post a couple months ago, and he was writing a story about the Oklahoma prison system going back to their old phone rates. Um, he actually told me that seeing the article that we wrote gave him the background that he needed to write this story. So I would call this an example of shaping news coverage. Um, I'll do another example that's less depressing. A couple years ago, the Nevada legislature decriminalized several traffic offenses. Um, if anyone from the Fines and Fees Justice Center is here, sorry to put you in the hot seat, or not really in the hot seat, but to spotlight you. But I'll just say that the Fines and Fees Justice Center, which advocated for these changes, also were active participants in media coverage of these changes. Um, Now, you can imagine the kind of story that might have been written about several traffic offenses being decriminalized. The headline could have been "Traffic violators will get off scot-free under the new law." Instead, here's a very reasonable headline in the Nevada Independent. And then there's several quotes here from Fines and Fees about how this is going to lift the burden of criminalization and stop people from ending up with warrants just because they were speeding. So this is, you can actually shape coverage of something that you are in the process of making a reality. Um, I'll move on to what we call clippings. Clippings are what we call news stories that have particular movement value. You can share them around to influence how people see certain issues in the system or get people to pay attention. Um, I'll share another example from our work. We recently wrote a memo about Shelby County, Tennessee's proposal to build a new jail. Of course, a memo is a very wonky document, and very few people outside the government are going to take the trouble to read it. But we wanted to spread the word about it. We sent it to a few reporters, and we were able to get some coverage of it in an outlet called the Daily Memphian. This is something that a lot more people are going to read, and it might change some people's minds about the jail, and those people can then speak up about it. Um, Please excuse the bragging I'm continuing to do here. But here's three more clippings that the Prison Policy Initiative has gotten. These all have different types of movement value. The Pennsylvania or the Philadelphia Inquirer editorial about how the state should stop suspending driver's licenses for non-driving offenses. This was probably seen by a few state lawmakers. The next year after this was published, they changed the law. And this probably played some amount of role. Um, the Bolts article about Minnesota ending prison gerrymandering was valuable, in my view, because some policymakers or decision makers in states that haven't ended prison gerrymandering will probably read it. Um, so I raise these up just to say if you're trying to raise the profile of a specific issue, or if you're trying to spread the word about a victory, or convince people to vote or to campaign a certain way, the media can be kind of like a megaphone, spreads your message to the people who can make a difference. Of course, you want to think about whose attention you're trying to get with the story that you're trying to get placed. Sometimes, for example, your audience might be state legislators. In many states, there are news outlets that report exclusively on state government and issues relevant to the legislature. So if you want to get legislator eyeballs on an issue, it's wise to start to try to pitch that kind of outlet. Uh, One thing to keep in mind uh, is that if you are trying to reach a general audience, they will often be getting their news on social media. Unfortunately, some social networks like Twitter will bury links to other websites. So if you have a news story and you want to get it to a larger audience, you might just want to take screenshots of the story and post them to social. Um, but in general, when you're seeking to use the media as a megaphone, just keep in mind who you want to reach and think about where they get their news. We've got two more ways of using the media that I'll talk about. Um, One is augmenting your own research. Most advocates do some amount of work investigating the forces that are driving criminal legal system policy, and journalists can be sort of silent partners in that effort. For example, we got a request from the Texas Tribune to talk to them about tablet computers in prisons and jails. That's something that we've done some research on. I took this request and talked to them partly because uh, I knew that when they reported this story, they would lift up some details about Texas's tablet contracts in jails that would be helpful for us in our own research about these issues. Um, Let's see here. Um, and then, so finally, I want to highlight that journalists can sometimes help you put pressure on the system. Journalists have this nice, I'm just asking questions kind of capacity, and where they can get a government agency to take a stand on an issue where otherwise the agency might have felt like they could get away with staying silent about it. For example, there was a reporter I was talking to who shared this story with me. She works at Wisconsin Watch. She was in touch with, I think, about 20 people incarcerated in Wisconsin, who many of whom raised to her that the phones were having a lot of problems. I think the phones had just been down for like weeks. They raised this to her, and she actually was interested in that, and she contacted the Department of Corrections about it. Um, she turned it into a story in which she got the DOC on record saying that if the problems were the provider's fault, or excuse me, the DOC was on record saying the problems are the provider's fault, and they committed to reevaluate the contract if the problems were not solved. So this can be helpful. Um, we unfortunately we can't advise you on how to get reporters on your side in this way, and it's not a silver bullet. But it's one of the potential benefits of cultivating not just one-off transactions with reporters, but longer relationships. All right. Moving on. Uh, this is where we start talking about the how. How do you influence the press? Um, this is a little bit like alchemy, and I want to highlight before I go into this that this is an area where um, I'm someone with a lot of experience. I think I have more um, I have mo I usually don't get reporters to do what I want them to do, right? So you shouldn't go into this thinking like, oh, if it doesn't work for me, I'm just bad at this. This is just something that takes effort, takes time. Um and and uh so there's and there's practice that's involved. But we'll talk about kind of two different ways that you can go about it. There's an informal strategy and then there's a formal strategy, not mutually exclusive. Um, the informal way is by building relationships that go beyond trying to get reporters to cover a single issue. The formal way is by pitching or for making a case for reporters to write a very specific story. And I'll turn this over to Hannah first to talk about the relationship building.
Okay, we're getting to the part where you're going to be like, this is incredibly obvious. And that's true. This is what I'm about to talk about is not rocket science, but it is effective. Not 100%, as Wanda said. Don't make that your benchmark for success. But so very, very obvious. Reporters are people. They work in a profession that's not easy to work in right now for a number of reasons. It's often maligned. A lot of folks either feel really intimidated to speak with press or just sort of assume that they're the enemy. So I think approach them like any other important professional contact. Be friendly, be straightforward, be respectful. Their emails are typically public, and you should be able to just reach out easily. You don't need to have a reason to reach out. I don't have a screenshot of this, but I think, if this is just a cold outreach, this is someone on a beat that you think it's worth having a relationship with, send them an email, talk a little bit about who you are, what your organization does. If you have resources, share them. If maybe their outlet has covered your work before, share that, and ask them to go and get a coffee. Not every reporter is going to respond to a cold email, but a lot of them will. They really want sources across the board. And I also like to remind people, I guess, unless you're doing this work remotely and you're national, you live in the same community. So there's already that like built-in common ground. I don't know how easy it is to read the screenshot here, but I included this as one of the ways that this turned into a really nice relationship. Basically, this news station ran a piece on ballistics testing that was basically a copy and paste job from a police press release. And the kinds of methods that they were using, had are just basically junk science. So someone from the local public defender office reached out to me and flagged the story, said like, is it worth talking to this reporter, letting him know a little bit more context? So, I reached out. We hadn't had any interaction before this. Tried to not make it seem like I was scolding, but saying, here's a source who could offer you a little bit more information on this, sourcing some things so it's clear that I'm not just making these things up. And then just, offering to find a time to meet and get coffee and chat. So we ended up doing that. They ran a follow-up spot that was actually longer than the initial piece. That was an interview with this person who could talk about junk science. And then, this just turned into I would say maybe every 2.5 months, we just get coffee. I can sort of share what I'm hearing from folks on the ground. Sometimes like we just talk about the weather and our dogs. So this is an example of a way that this initial outreach can go, but you really don't need a reason. I'll keep sort of harping on this, but you are all experts. You know a lot more than most of these reporters know about the system. And I think it's easy to forget that. But if you share that expertise willingly and generously, that's really invaluable. I think that's important to remember. All right, next slide. So strong relationships change the kinds of stories that get told. Like that has just been very true in my experience. The biggest shifts in coverage come from sort of changing someone's analysis of the system by giving them more context over time, introducing them to a variety of sources, and making it clear that your role here is just to help their coverage be more accurate, more in-depth, more nuanced. So I've seen beats evolve through this kind of relationship. And I think because the lines in these relationships are open both ways, again, this is really important. You can plug them into a broader mix of sources. So, directly impacted folks or their families, practitioners like public defenders or investigators or public teachers, people who are steeped in the data around the criminal legal system. All of this source broadening is going to make coverage, again, more accurate and fair. And over time, I think the beats are going to shift, sort of moving away from like a crime blotter, more reliant on a state or a police narrative, and into something that's maybe a bit more focused on outcomes. And, I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of the Axios style framing where you get asked for a quote in a story and your quote is at the very bottom, sort of as like and here's what the opposition says, which better than having nothing in there for sure. But the tenor of the story hasn't changed. And I don't think that we can change the tenor of the story without these relationships that take time and effort. If you go to a press conference where it is anything related to policing, I think you'll notice that like the anchor for your local Fox affiliate goes over and like bumps fists with the PIO officer from the sheriff's department. Like they know each other, they've worked together for a long time, they trust each other. And at the outset, we tried to set up how clear it is that they have this apparatus in place to get their narrative out there. And a lot of that is relationship based for them as well. So do you want to go to the next slide, Wanda? I want to talk briefly about a project that has really shown just how fruitful these relationships can be. There's a project in Chicago that CJJ has been sort of peripherally involved with. It's run by the organization Zealous, and is working with, basically they've convened community members, impacted folks, advocates, practitioners, and folks from WBEZ, which is Chicago's NPR station, and the Chicago Sun-Times. And initially, these convenings were truly just relationship building. There's always food involved, there's coffee. It's just getting to know each other as fellow Chicagoans, and not necessarily baked into roles of media and advocate or community member. I've been on some of the Zooms. This project has been going for over 2 years now, where we didn't talk about the news at all. And instead they talked about like the White Sox or the weather. And it was like lovely. And people genuinely got to know each other well, to care about each other in a professional setting. And because there was this basis of a trusting relationship that went beyond like just a one-time pitch, sort of less transactional, it makes it easier to talk about the things that the media can get wrong. So this screenshot is an example of a story that people felt pretty badly about. There was a conversation with folks from the Sun-Times about, I've cropped it, but the image is really bad. It's just like a still from, I think, a surveillance camera. These teenagers who were accused of stealing cars. It was a very sensationalist piece that a lot of community members and advocates felt missed the mark, and sort of added to this environment of fear, and would just be used to get into this policy freakout loop where the penalties are just worsened. So there was this opportunity for real feedback. I think there was probably a little bit less defensiveness than might have existed without good, trusting relationships. You want to go to the next slide, Wanda? And instead, the conversation turned to, here's what I actually feel is impacting safety in my community. And one of the things that was talked about was lead in Chicago, which is everywhere. So they just came out with this like very cool interactive map that you can use to find out if there's water or if there's lead in your water line. And, to go back to Wanda's original point, it's not every coffee that you have with a journalist is going to result in like a cool interactive piece like this, instead of writing about, kids in the system, obviously. Also, journalists are beholden to their editors, who are beholden to a whole lot of other forces. So it's complicated. And I don't use this example to say that this is just how it's going to go immediately. But over the years that this project has been going on, I have really seen a shift in the ways that these journalists think about safety, the way they think about the system, and the way they think about other things that are impacting safety in different ways in these communities in Chicago. And I could put, I think, a bunch of other examples, which I'm not going to do, but it really has shifted the tenor, the nuance, the accuracy of these stories. And it's been a big time commitment, but I think it was really worth it. All right. Hand to you, Wanda.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, here. So I am spotlighted. Still getting used to this. I'll start talking now about the formal way of getting journalists to do what you want, and that is pitching them. This is what you do when you want a reporter to write a very specific story. Now, Hannah got into this a little bit, but one of the nice things about talking to the press is that reaching out cold is never awkward. You can pitch somebody that you've never talked to before. It's completely acceptable. It's not acceptable to just call a random person and say, hey, I want you to do this. But it's kind of acceptable to call a reporter and say, hey, I'd like you to write this story. I will say, as a disclaimer, though, that if there is a reporter you have a relationship with who could write the story you want, I would always recommend going to them first. Now, in my opinion and in my experience, pitching is about two things. First is giving the reporter a story that is newsworthy, and then the second is giving them some of the resources that they need to write that story. I'll give you a couple examples of pitches that I've written. Here are two that I wrote that led to stories. This one on the left led to a short piece in The Guardian about women on probation and parole, and the restrictions they face on going out of state for abortion care. And then the one on the right led to a TV news story in Colorado about a jail hiking its phone rates back up in the wake of the FCC decision earlier this year. Um, just a few kind of basic writing things that I'll flag first. First is I don't spend a lot of time introducing myself or prefacing what I'm going to say. I just go straight into it. On the pitch on the left, I don't know how easy this is to read, but it says, "Hey, Jessica, the one-two punch of laws restricting abortions and standard blah, 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 blah." But I didn't do any prefacing. I just went right into it, and that's okay. Honestly, the pitch on the right probably would have been stronger if I had just gone right into what is here, the third paragraph, saying, "This morning I heard from two people with loved ones in the Adams County Jail." Um, these are both long pitches, um, and I wanted to put everything out there that might be helpful to the reporter in deciding to write the story. But I structured them so that the big takeaways are close to the top. Um, Actually, in the case of the Adams County pitch, the big takeaway is in the headline or the subject line. So just some general writing stuff to think about. Now, like I said a minute ago, pitching is about convincing reporters that a topic that you care about is newsworthy. Um, Now, not every story is newsworthy. For example, a couple weeks ago, I moved a bunch of furniture around in my house and it confused my cat. And in to punish me, my cat peed on my bed. That's a story, but it is not newsworthy. So what makes something newsworthy? We can turn to the Purdue Writing Lab and this resource that's designed for journalists. And they say newsworthiness largely boils down to relevance, timeliness, and simplification. Um, so what is a relevant issue? Here's a story about Adams County, Colorado. This was I think, a pretty easy pitch to get accepted, partly because the story impacts a lot of people in Adams County. Um, uh, Probably not more than half people, but it impacts a sizable number of folks because it is in addition to impacting incarcerated people, jail phone rates also impact their families. I actually think that one of the most successful media campaigns that the Prison Policy Initiative has done over the years has been around phone rates. And this is a big part of why. When you talk about an issue that impacts families, you increase the relevance of the issue. And so that makes it more newsworthy. Um, so this is also why trying to get a news story about an individual person in prison facing abuse or mistreatment is unfortunately really hard. That story, like it or not, is not relevant to most people. And so that's where journalists, even a journalist who wants to pick that story up is going to try to figure out how do we make this into something about a larger issue. Um, Timeliness. What is a timely issue? That is something that relates to maybe another topic that's already in the news. This was a capital B story that came out a couple weeks ago about the sort of the history of cashless bail and the successes of cashless bail. Now, it's no secret why that story happened to come out a couple weeks ago. It's because Donald Trump signed an executive order trying to limit and destroy cashless bail. The kind of irony about some of the work that we do is that sometimes when things get worse, our work gets more newsworthy. And I lie awake at night sometimes thinking about that, but it does make my job easier on occasion. Um, and then finally, we have simplicity, right? A simple issue is one that can boil down into a headline that is skimmable and accessible to most people. Um, I'll flag here, there was a report a couple years ago from, what did I say a couple years ago? I think it was this year. Now I'm looking at the date. But there was a report by the Idaho Justice Project that found that Idaho incarcerates more women per capita than any other state. And the genius of this report, I think, was that it went into a lot of detail about policies and practices that contribute to Idaho's incarceration of women. But the big takeaway was simple. Idaho leads nation in women's incarceration. They basically wrote the headline for the reporters, and that made this all the easier for journalists to pick up. This is a nice story they got in Investigate West. Um, let's see. I feel like the section was longer, but it wasn't. The last two tips that I want to give about pitching. First is if you can find a reporter that has written before about the issue that you are trying to get them to write about, that's a great reporter to reach out to. Even if it's someone, again, that you've not talked to before, it makes for a slightly easier email to write. You can say, I saw your story about X topic. I wanted to urge you to write about this again in the context of blah, blah, blah. And then you say what you're talking about. Um, uh, and then the other thing is, and this is the same thing that applies to just about every email, pitches that go out early in the day and pitches that go out early in the week, especially on Mondays, are more likely to be successful. So if you come up with a great pitch idea on a Friday afternoon, don't send it, just schedule it for Monday morning. Um, and for those of you who are on the West Coast like me, if you're trying to reach a reporter who might be on the East Coast, keep that in mind and schedule those emails for when they'll be waking up. Um, for the last part of this webinar, I want to talk about something that can strengthen a pitch and can build your credibility with reporters, but that comes with a risk. And that is connecting journalists with directly impacted sources. Um, Reporters know that a personal lens in a story is one of the things that gets people to read. So almost every news article about an issue also includes a story about a person. Nice example here on the right. There's a story that Michelle Pitcher in Texas wrote about parole and the failures of parole systems. The first three sentences are about this woman, Jasmine Torres. Um, there's two or three sentences about her. You never hear about her in the story again. It is literally a quick little paragraph just to snag people's attention because it works. Um, so uh, for reporters, oftentimes actually getting that personal anecdote or story is the biggest obstacle to writing. It can be quite hard for them to do this. So they may ask you to connect them with somebody. And whether or not you want to do this is a choice that you have to make on a case-by-case basis. Um, if you or a directly impacted person you know consents to an interview about their experience, I want to offer some tips for staying in control of the conversation. Um, First, it's helpful to get clear on what the reporter plans to do with your interview. You might want to ask, is my personal experience going to be a big part of this story? Now, if they say yes, and that makes you uncomfortable, you can choose not to do it. Um, you can also get even more granular and ask for questions in advance. Sometimes I'll ask a reporter to just send along a couple questions that they know they're going to ask, so I get a sense of the vibe of the interview. Um, I find that an even more airtight way of controlling the conversation is to proactively tell the reporter what I can and can't speak to. I put an example of this over on the right. A reporter at the Marshall Project emailed us asking to talk about how prisons communicate or don't communicate with families after someone dies. That's just not something that we're experts on. We've never researched this. And I don't want to come off in this person's story like I'm an expert. That's just some image management on my part. Um, so I emailed her back and said, hey, I'm happy to give my personal impressions based on anecdotes that I've heard, but we haven't studied this, and I can't speak from an expert standpoint. And she heard that, and I think most reporters will hear that, and they will be glad that you've told them and incorporate your desire to shape the conversation. Um, Now, lastly, you can control the conversation by preparing talking points and practicing bringing a conversation back to those points. A great saying that I learned from my colleague Mike is questions are for dopes. Ultimately, a reporter has to work with what you give them, right? Whatever goes on the record, whatever goes into their notes, that's what they have to put in their story. So it's all about what you bring to the conversation. Um, these are some tips that I think anyone can use to feel more comfortable going into an interview. But of course, people who are under state supervision are going to face unique risks. And I'll hand it back over to Hannah to talk about minimizing those.
Yes. God, there's a lot of words in this slide. I'm sorry. I start by saying, we don't want to be paternalistic here. People who are currently incarcerated or still under some kind of state control obviously know their lives and make their own choices. Our job is just to scaffold a safer experience so they can decide, with eyes fully open. Because I imagine some other folks on this call have had similar experiences. I've had some, friends and clients who have gotten really, really burned by media. So just trying to scaffold safety here. There's also just some common traps that even I like. For example, recently a story was written in aggregate. The story was actually really good, nuanced, fair, but it opened just with the first couple of sentences about this woman's the crime that led her to go to prison. And because the rest of the story was paywalled, if you didn't have an account, if you Google it, you know, the paywall cuts off after the first few sentences. So Google and social previews just sort of like freeze the crime details forever. And that was just something that she felt upset by. I hadn't considered. So, constantly learning what the potential pitfalls are. And again, I think part of our role is just flagging risks like that upfront and negotiating ways to reduce them. So before connecting anyone, ask the reporter what story they're doing or making, why this person, whether a background conversation could potentially meet the need. You could stage it so that sort of specific answers go on the record later, but only if the person consents. I think it's really important to do a scan of the person's past work, potentially even looking more broadly at the outlet. And then be really clear with setting terms before any kind of interview or conversation happens. What's on or off the record, how the person will be described is important. I know formerly incarcerated people who use depiction agreements, which are written agreements that the reporter has to agree to in advance. It'll usually contain, what the person will be called, person first language, what parts of the case can or can't be mentioned, what images are okay to use. And I think something like that really helps people go into these situations feeling more protected. I think, if you work in comms or PR or something like that, you can help the outlet minimize harm in what the public actually sees. So, ask that they lead with present day context of the person, work, family, rather than case details. Request person first language. I think across the board, that's easy to do. Supply non-mugshot or other state photos. Talk explicitly, if you can, about the headline or the SEO description. A lot of reporters are going to say that's out of my hands, but I think it's worth trying to have the conversation anyway. I've even asked, like, what's the social copy going to look like? Because I've seen a piece be really good, and then the social media post has this inflammatory bad language. And, consistently throughout this process, if an outlet can't commit to something that feels safe, then you weigh that along with the person thinking about talking to them in your decision making. Obviously, handle all these logistics with safety is in mind. If someone is currently inside, assume that calls are recorded and monitored. If they're on supervision, obviously avoid details that could look at all like violations. Be careful about schedules and locations. The Freedom of the Press Foundation has really good guidance on interviewing incarcerated people. So not a bad idea to just send this along, ask if they've read it before. And one other thing that I just thought about now and didn't put in the bullets is maybe think about like suggesting some kind of co-reporting with an incarcerated journalist when the story calls for it. There's been, The Guardian, the New York Times, the Nation, and many others have done really powerful pieces reported with an inside journalist and an outside journalist. And I think done well, it really improves accuracy, and it shifts the frame to like about this population to with, shares compensation, which is important, and authorship, editorial power, with the person who has the closest possible knowledge of the system. And I have some resources on co-reporting. I'll drop a link in afterwards. But yeah, that's that.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Um, this wraps it up for our presentation. We will get into Q&A now. But just before we do, I will, for those of you that need to jump off, I just want to flag this right now. For one thing, if there's a question that you don't get answered, or if this webinar didn't quite scratch the itch that you were looking for, please email us. I've put our emails here. And we are, very happy to talk to people about whatever it is that, you might need help with. The Prison Policy Initiative has a small department of people whose whole job is to talk to advocates and to provide whatever support we can. So please do reach out. We'd love to hear from you. The Prison Policy Initiative also has a newsletter that I wanted to plug. This slide is mostly just advertising. And then lastly, both of our organizations have social media. Please follow us. It makes us happy. Mike, I think I will turn it over to you to moderate a Q&A.
Yep. So we've got a number of questions here, and if folks have more, they can definitely drop them in the Q&A section. We'll try to get through as many as we can. The first is about the topic of op-eds. We didn't talk about op-eds. Do you have any thoughts on specific types of media that they should pitch op-eds to and kind of the purposes for those?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. I think this is where I would come back to the same principle of getting clippings, which is who are you trying to speak to with your megaphone? Um, I if you're trying to get something in front of in front of state legislators, you're probably going to want to go beyond a city or a local paper, unless you live in a city with a very, paper with a lot of gravitas like the New York Times. Um, I I would say an op-ed is also something to, where you want to consider. I I'll be honest, like your existing standing and reach, and reputation, the more name recognition you have, the more likely it is to get an op-ed accepted in a higher profile news outlet. Um, uh, but I think that, if what you're trying to do is just kind of spread your message and um, maybe even, stir the pot so that people who are of like mind come out of the woodwork, I think it's more important just to have a succinct and well-written piece, where your arguments are tight, where you're anticipating counter arguments and you're addressing those, when you're making it clear, the relevance that this issue has to more than just a handful of people who might be reading. So I would say that would be my advice. Hannah, you have anything to add to that?
Nope, that was great. My main point was just going to be figure out who your really specific niche audience is, and then yeah, if you're like, okay, I have the audience, but I don't know the media landscape, maybe we can help. I guess it depends where you live, but yeah, lean on other folks doing similar work, to sort of help you figure out where that audience goes for their news.
Mhm.
Next, we have a question from a media perspective. How might advocates work around or respond to high profile issues that might be used to amplify pro punishment platforms? Think about high profile cases that have been around the country.
Mhm. Oh boy.
Great question.
Um, yeah, great question, and I can't promise a perfect answer. I uh I would say this is okay, I'll give my I guess my approach to this, which is if this is part of a conversation that your organization is already engaged in, you're going to want to develop um, a strategy that puts your perspective out there as much as possible. So I guess one might be um, bail reform, right? So it like someone is out on bail, they commit a high profile crime. In today's environment, that always gets spun into some kind of news event. Um, this is a case where I think I would be, if your organization is already involved in bail reform efforts, it is very worth it to get to put yourself out there to offer to reporters, we can talk about this, and to go and speak about the importance of, in this case, hypothetical case, bail reform, put any data out there that might preempt uh, uh, sensationalist coverage. And also, I think this is a great example of where it could be helpful to ask a reporter, "Hey, can we talk off the record?" Then you can even say, you can just call them and say, "Hey, I know that this thing has happened. Um, this has the potential to be covered in a very biased way. I would like to have a conversation and talk to you about some of the systemic issues that are underlying this and give my perspective, which is ABC." Um, this is all to say that if you don't have a pre-existing engagement with the issue, whether it's bail, whether it's parole release, right, harm reduction, whatever, I would not get involved. That is going to create, I mean, I think I'm speaking to right now a lot of organizations that don't have a ton of capacity for press engagement. I think there's a lot of reasons to stay out of news cycles that don't directly involve stuff that you're thinking about or campaigning on.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And the only thing I would maybe add, if you are going to get in the mix because it feels related, you've got a close relationship with the reporter who asked you, I can, think of plenty of reasons. I do think it's a good opportunity. You don't want to just be on defensive the entire time. I think to sort of go on offense, you can say, here are programs that have worked to reduce harm in certain communities. Here's the data that we know exists, and here's a trend snapshot of that. So we're not just looking at 1 year. I think it's. I mean, I echo everything Wanda said, and in general, like it's a losing game, especially depending on the outlet. But to the extent that there can be like a little bit of solutions journalism that says, look, here's what we know unequivocally works to reduce violence, harm, whatever. And then list a few of those things. And then ideally, if you could point the reporter to places where these things are sort of being experimented with, like is there violence interruption programs or new after school programs for kids who didn't have third spaces to go to, something that reorients the conversation to the things that we know work, which are not cages, and the people in the community who are doing those experiments. I think that can be helpful.
The next question, we're living in an era when facts don't seem to matter when it comes to issues like crime, immigration, etc. How do advocates navigate this current media and political landscape where data is often dismissed? Do we need to adjust our approach and rely more on storytelling, etc.? An easy question.
Um, Hannah, do you want to take a first stab at this one?
Sure. I feel like I'm going to sound like a broken record with these two questions, but I
They are
think,
kind of similar, I think.
yeah, I think data gets dismissed when it feels like disconnected from our lives. And, there's all this evidence that our understanding of our own safety comes very much from what we read and see. Pew does these surveys every year and asks Americans, do you think crime is going up or down? And every single year without fail, people are like, it's worse. And like right now, for example, murders are at like an absolute historic low. And I don't think people feel that way. So one thing to say, and I think to maybe it's helpful to remind journalists of, is like they are deeply responsible for how we perceive safety. We're just like not good at that as humans. And I am like totally guilty of this. If I watch sensationalist TV news, I'm like, I'm going to be abducted tomorrow. It's just, it really warps everything that we see. So I think, reminding journalists that we can braid evidence with values and stories. So again, if we're talking about data points, I think it's helpful to remind readers or viewers where we are. And then again, if you can bring in a story, if you can give them a source, you know, a a program that does like unarmed response to 911 calls, or there's a cool program in Baltimore that's like a compost club and like sometimes works with kids who have just come out of detention, like trying to both, yes, give data, which is easy to be disconnected from, and then to say, and look, here's the way that this is sort of interwoven with something happening in your community right now. I think that's kind of your best bet, because we don't want to just be stuck sort of playing defense on their narrative all the time, because that it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I like that answer.
There are two questions kind of about newsworthiness that I'm going to merge into one. One is just general. Can you talk a little bit more about conveying the newsworthiness or relevance of an issue, particularly around kind of wonky policy memos and things of that nature? And then somebody's also curious if you had any thoughts or could give an example of something that you would consider not newsworthy and from a criminal legal system perspective. Just sometimes the opposite is helpful.
Yeah. Um, I think that's really important to talk about because every reporter is trying to put out a quote unquote story, right? But how do you turn the fact that the criminal legal system is racist, unfair, harsh into a story when that's just the way it is, right? Like, and I think that uh, it can be helpful to just think about stories as being about change. The one thing, I guess, one example is um, parole. You could email a reporter and say, you know, parole rates in my state are really low. Um, And that might get the reporter's attention if that's something that's completely new to them and they happen to be in the right place to receive that information and be surprised by that. But if you can say, parole rates in our state have hit a new low, it has not been this low in 50 years. That's more of a story. It's more newsworthy because um, uh, it's something that has changed over time and it's something that is different now than it has ever been. Um, I guess I'd also say, um, uh, talking about like um, aggregating injustice into data is something that I think makes things more newsworthy in general. I talked a bit about the difficulty of getting reporters to write about a single individual. Um, if you can write about, for instance, rather than a single person, this is maybe not a great example because this data is hard to get, but if you don't just write about a single person being thrown in solitary for, a minor like disciplinary allegation, but in fact, minor disciplinary tickets being responsible for, a third of all people sent to solitary confinement over the course of a year, that is more newsworthy. Um, I think when it comes to, policy reports that your organization has put together, I think you might actually have less work to do than you think. Um, Journalists are often very interested in reading reports, and even if they're not going to cover the report itself, they will probably incorporate it into future reporting. And that's something that you can also say in your outreach. Say, hey, um, here is a report that we wrote. Here are the top line findings. I would like this to be useful in your work. Let me know if you would like to talk about it. And that's something that can lead to coverage over time. Um, Hannah, anything to add to that?
No, that was perfect.
Cool.
Next is from someone, they said, I'm surrounded by criminal legal system experts, but don't consider my organization, but I don't consider myself to be an expert. How can I improve my ability to be a spokesperson for our work as communications manager? Or is it okay to just build my comm skills and defer to my colleagues when a spokesperson is needed?
Hannah?
Great question. I feel you. I think a couple of things. One, Wanda touched on this in the slide about sort of staying in control of interactions with media. I think a huge thing that you can do is make sure that every time you go into any interaction with the media, you like have your talking points. Um, I think it's a good opportunity to work with colleagues who maybe have like deeper understandings of these systems to make the talking points. I think it's a good opportunity for collaboration. But I think, obviously this is a personal question on some levels, but I think there's an opportunity for both things to happen. As you keep doing this work and sort of the more deeply ensconced you get into it, you will understand and know things that even if you don't feel like an expert, are beyond what, a journalist on like an enterprise beat knows, or even just about the specific work of your organization. So I feel like partially I want to be like, I bet you are more expert than you think you are. But also there's huge value in just being someone who has real skill in aggregating the work that y'all do, working with your colleagues to figure out, what the most important points are, making sure that you have these really clear, concise points that you can then sort of translate to media. And I think when you do that, you'll start to feel sort of like both of these things are happening. You're becoming more of an expert in the subject matter, and also strengthening your position as the spokesperson. But I definitely remember feeling like that at many points in my career because I've only worked with lawyers and I'm not a lawyer.
Mhm.
Next, we have a question from someone who says, I feel like I've tried a lot of pitching and statements, and I'm just not getting interest in our side of the story. It's also not a friendly environment to invite reporters for coffee because we're in in the conservative South, and the media seems more interested in criminalization. Do we just keep trying?
Yeah. Um, I think uh, you could keep trying. Nothing wrong with that. I think that if you're pitching and it's not working, um, maybe trying uh I think that to call back to what Hannah said about how the most impactful um the most impactful change kind of comes from building these relationships with reporters. I might shift to focusing on that. And now I take your point about it being, you're in a conservative area and reporters are focused on criminalization. I do not envy you there. Um, I have to say though that there are kind of diamonds in the rough. I connected earlier this year with a reporter named Sarah Raza, who works for the AP in South Dakota. She is not she is not from South Dakota. She went to journalism school elsewhere. Um, she was sent to South Dakota to be their State Bureau reporter. There are a lot of reporters like this who are in a position of they're young, they're new to the beat, and they probably don't share the same kinds of ingrained biases that some, more veteran reporters might have. I have found that talking to her has been way more effective in terms of getting, drumming up interest in the kinds of issues that we want to percolate there. And so, yeah, I mean, I, I feel lucky to have 40 hours a week to devote to this stuff. But even if you can just find one person in your area who is more amenable to hearing about this and doesn't just want to write about how your state needs harsher laws, I would say cultivating a relationship with that person is worth it.
Yeah, I would just add, I also I feel like I have had similar experiences in my career. When I was at Southern Center, we worked quite a bit with media in Alabama, more sort of historically conservative outlets. And I would say two things. I don't know if you've sort of tried to do the outreach to just get a coffee and they've rejected it, in which case, like, all right, what are you going to do? But if you haven't, you might be surprised. I have been very surprised by reporters that I've met in person and just been able to have friendly, nuanced conversations with. Like, it's very clear that we're coming at this with extremely different viewpoints, but I come armed with a lot of resources and data, and often you'll find, in these very conservative areas that they haven't been exposed to that at all. So in some places, that makes me feel like, oh, that's even more necessary to try to reach out on this person to person level on the off chance that they are someone who is moved by facts. And then, yeah, just echoing Wanda, it might be worth seeing if there are Report for America cohort members who are in your area at all. I'm working with a couple of them sort of across the Deep South, Mississippi and Alabama, and I think Louisiana. Yeah, they're young. They are, in my experience, like very smart and eager to learn and eager to build up source lists. So yeah, invite the conservative guy out for a coffee and just see what happens if you haven't, and look for younger like RFA members, or you can see where they're placed, I think, on their website. But yeah, I empathize. It's hard.
So the next question, I think this will have to be our last just because we're running short on time. Given that so many people now get their news from alternative or non-traditional outlets, should we engage with these platforms to reach certain audiences? How do we balance the value of reaching them with the risk of legitimizing extreme sources?
Hmm. Um, this is gonna, I mean, I think this has to be case by case. I assume that you're talking about far right sources, and I think it kind of depends on the reporter. Um, it is, I would never encourage you to take a press request that seems to be made in bad faith. Um, like, for example, someone reaching out saying, "Hey, we've had a crime wave in our area. How does your criminal justice reform organization feel about that?" You don't have to engage with any question like that. Um, on the other hand, um, I think if there's someone who reaches out who appears to be balanced or appears to genuinely want your perspective, I think that you stand a lot more to gain in the from those conversations than to lose. I think not everyone would agree with me about the benefits versus costs of working with an extreme outlet. But I want to say I'm saying this trying to recognize that in some places that may be prevailing local news. Um, and it is better to get your voice out there in whatever way you can, I think, than to be effectively silenced by the bias in the media. And I say that partly because that is what the right wing does. Like, you will never find the right shrinking from an opportunity to be in Time magazine, um, or other, kind of quote unquote liberal news outlets. Um, so I think that that's something that that advocates should also be. You don't beat yourself up about doing that. Hannah, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's super case by case. I guess I'm not totally sure what they mean by extreme sources. I think I could interpret that a couple of different ways.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very case by case. You don't want to take bait, for Wanda's
Mhm.
points, but to the extent, and this is really difficult to do because it's just hard to get this data, but to the extent that you can figure out where people get their news in your community,
Mhm.
like I sort of, because I started off doing this work, God, many years ago, I was sort of stuck in the like everyone reads like the legacy paper of my, the town that I'm in, and the New York Times and AP, and like Actually, that's not that true. Like most people get their news through TikTok or TV news. So at a certain point, it does make sense to sort of try to take stock of where people are getting their news, and if all signs are pointing to a less traditional outlet that you feel like, you can still go home with your head held high after speaking with them, then I think it absolutely makes sense. If that's where the eyes are. And this is increasingly true as like everything gets paywalled and
Yeah.
algorithms run everything. But yeah, it's case by case.
Yeah, and to your point, in those situations, it might be time to pivot to more focusing more on social. Um, it's not like if you're I simply refuse to believe that right-wing media is representative of how most people feel, or like how the vast majority of people feel in any state. Sorry. I think that there are still lots of people out there who are going to be amenable to hearing what you have to say. And if those people are getting their news from social media, from, influencers in their area, then that's maybe who you should be targeting. Um, I'm lucky in that we get so many press requests at PPI that I am kind of able to not take the ones that are that strike me as like I don't like this outlet. But if I had more time, I would, um, because I think it's worth it. Um, Mike, are we going to close out there?
I think we need to get off here at 4:30.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. And again, if you have questions that didn't get answered, please do reach out to us. So happy to be able to talk to you guys.
Yes, thanks so much.
All right. All right. Take care, everyone.